Hello again, everybody. My name is John D. Healy. I do a podcast. It's called It's Good to Talk, and it sure is good to talk. People know me because I produced a book for my friend Tony McGurn, and that's how it all started. It's about his life story from 1941 up until recently. Yes, he's still alive. He's doing well. He's hanging in there. This book is about over 300 pages long. There's some naughty stories, but real stories. A lot of history from both Ireland in the early days, coming to New York during the civil rights, stories from down south, and then taxi driving, truck driving, bartender, bar owner. You can get it on Amazon. It's also on audio, and the audio version is also on this podcast. My sponsors are Liffey Van Lines, a moving company here in New York City, and they've been around a long time. They've been around longer than Jeopardy, longer than the New York City Marathon. They do quality moving all over international, and just last month they made it into Forbes magazine as being one of the best moving companies, 10 moving companies in all of the United States of America. That's a big achievement for Liffey, but then again, they're consistent. I always have interesting people on my show. Today is no exception. She has been on before, a couple of years ago, I think, on a different topic, but she's a different topic today. My guest is Erin Moore. So I'm going to say hello to Erin Moore and see what she's up to now in her new career, I guess. Hello, Erin.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me. Nice to be here.
Okay, tell us a little bit about your background, maybe where you were born, how you got into what you do, and where now to this new, I guess you call it a new career for you.
Yes, thank you. I was actually born in Boston, Massachusetts, in the US, and I've found my way back, actually. I'm currently living back in Boston. I've moved around a lot in my life, West Coast, East Coast. I've done a lot of world travel and such. And we met in New York when I was living there. I've always actually been in mental health and wellness in some capacity. I started out studying psychology and health communications. Those are what my original degrees are in. And then, and related to that, I've also always been a writer. So I've done copywriting for hospital systems. I have a blog where I write about mental health and well-being and holistic health type topics. And so I was in the corporate world and working for startups for several years. And then I kind of had my own journey of healing and exploration where I did a lot of retreats and workshops and studying. And I kind of got into the holistic space. And I do still think there's a lot of value in that, whether it's nutrition and health coaching. I do a bit of that still. And then I got into a little bit more of the esoteric holistic space. I was a Reiki practitioner for a while. I think that's when we did our prior
Yeah, the
interview.
last podcast we did, we dealt with that a lot, and that was a good podcast. I would tell my listeners to go back and check out some of the old podcasts. My guest is Erin Moore. Podcast is called It's Good to Talk. If you like it, subscribe. So continue on, Erin. Let's talk about where you are now.
Yeah, and so a lot of that stuff with in terms of doing, holistic healing work, I've always kind of helped people, and I still do that in terms of like honing their intuition, trusting their gut, setting boundaries. That's a lot of what my blog is about, and especially for sensitive people, the terms like highly sensitive person, empath, that has always kind of been my niche, and it still is. Um, but the way that more recently my journey has unfolded is more towards grief focused work. And that was always a factor in my own life and in clients' lives and people that I worked with over the years. But I more recently did a certification program in grief recovery. And I was aware in the past of how much unresolved grief affects us all. But in doing this training that I did, it kind of reinforced that not only for myself, but how much that's an important factor for all of us in our mental
Great.
health. Yeah.
Question for you is, like, we all deal with grief at different stages of our lives. Like at the end of this podcast, I will give my own personal experience of dealing with the death of my own parents, just so people can know one person's story may be slightly different, but one person's story can help another person to say, well, that was a good idea. So about you, like, how old were you when you had to deal with maybe the loss of your mother or your father?
Yeah, and this is a foundational piece for me because I did lose my mom when I was very young. I was 15. And so I had a very early experience of that, the trauma and the loss and how life-changing that is. And, I will say over the years, I mean, a lot of things have helped me. I think sometimes traditional therapy can be great. I think sometimes alternative methods can be great. But I do think sometimes those methods don't actually access the deeper pain and the baggage that we carry. And so this program that I did, it's unique in that way, in that it helps sort of complete what's incomplete emotionally.
Okay.
And it's like moving, yeah, it's helping us move from the head to the heart. And I think sometimes other methods
Okay,
aren't as,
another question I have for you is, say you were 15 years old, very young girl, when you
yep.
lost your mother. Now, I think from my point of view and other people, like, was your mother ill for a long time, or was it like a sudden accident?
She was ill for a little bit. It was about a year and a half, I
Okay.
believe. Yeah, so it wasn't one of those, sudden shocks, although of course it was still very shocking. And I think also being so young, um, it's almost like I was in shock. It was almost like a
Right.
disassociation.
Mm.
It was like almost like, and I've talked to people who have had, of course, losses even younger than that. But I think the studies show that our brains aren't actually fully developed until we're about 25.
Right.
And so I think that there can be a whole nother layer there when you're
Yeah.
young with it.
Well, that comes back to myself, because like yourself, I did study psychology and social psychology, and I think, say, if a parent or someone close to somebody has been ill for a long time, like in the case of my own sister here in New York, her husband was ill for over 15 years or more. So we would talk about this, and we knew, number one, it wasn't going to be a shock. Number two, we had already, your subconscious deals with the grieving already, and that's important people to know. Your subconscious has you mentally prepared to deal with everything related to the death and dying of a friend, whether it's a husband, a wife, or a brother or a sister, and you have time with them. That's important to talk about what I call photographs and memories, like the name of a song, and to go back over their life. So when it actually happens, of course, it's still a loss, and of course, there's still some grief, but nothing, I think, like, say, someone dies in a car crash or something sudden like that. Would you agree with that?
Right. Oh, yes. Yeah, it does. It can vary a lot. And it's almost like when you're saying when there's a longer period of time, it's almost like this anticipatory grief, where it's almost like, yeah, in a sense, you start grieving. And it might be a different type of grieving than happens after somebody passes or after the event. But it is very different. And, they're both deeply painful in their own way. But it does sometimes um the way to address it can vary a little bit depending how it
Right. Okay.
happened. But yeah.
Okay. And like say recently, like Shane McGowan died November 30th. His birthday is December 25th. And I think people like that, like Elvis died in 1977, and he was like a worldwide celeb, famous and all that. And people felt the need to grieve about someone, they just knew the music and they knew the person and they felt they knew more. Shane McGowan, as I said, died November 30th. His birthday is December 25th. And like people are grieving because of his popularity, and they
Yeah.
felt a connection with him, as if he was like a brother or an uncle, or a drinking buddy. Obviously, would be fit his personality probably more. So I think that's a different type of grief. Would you agree?
Yes, and it's almost like a collective grief and mourning, and it's kind of like when famous people or people that are in our culture or our zeitgeist, pass. It's almost like it kind of brings people to this reality of like their mortality, and it brings up grief in a slightly different way that we can all kind of connect with each other in that feeling that
Right,
loss culturally. Yeah.
culturally. Yeah. Okay, and the other thing I was going to kind of bring up that ties into this somewhat too is, say, the age of a person. Like the same week that Shane McGowan passed away, Henry Kissinger passed away. He's at
Right.
the age of 100. So I think when someone is the age of 100, it's kind of time to go. Pardon my uh,
Right.
respect or disrespect in that one,
Right.
uh, perhaps. But I know in Ireland, where I was born, if people get to over 85 or 90, it's considered a celebration. It's not grieving. We celebrate the life with music and song, just like the Shane McGowan funeral last weekend, where they sang and played music, and I'm sure they drank a few drinks to celebrate his life. And the other part I found interesting in Ireland too, in the Gaeltacht, which is the Irish-speaking area of Ireland, I grew up close to there, is where the village, the people, the neighbours and friends in the village help the person grieve. So, for example, if a young man dies at sea on a fishing boat, and that's kind of sudden in its own way, and it's tragic, but it's almost, number one, it's dangerous because they're out in the boat fishing, but it's the whole village helps the mother in the grief, and they do that by crying. It's called cleaner. So they all cry collectively, like a concert, and this crying goes on for hours and sometimes maybe days, and that's kind of another interesting aspect of the crying. And another thing I heard, and you can agree or disagree with this, is sometimes it's important to cry, and sometimes the most tears are shed at the gravesite. I'm thinking here of millenniums, those people that they don't realize that when a parent dies and that, and then all of a sudden they're crying, or maybe the money is cut off, maybe there is no money, but crying at the gravesite, it's a little bit too late. What do you think about that statement?
Um, Well, there's a lot of aspects to what you mentioned that are interesting. On one hand, I agree that tears are very therapeutic. And actually, one of my recent blogs, centeredone.com is my website. And I actually wrote a recent blog about crying and tears and how different emotions can come out through tears, including anger, but grief and loss. And actually, there's chemicals that are released with our tears that help us process and cope and grieve. So there's that piece in terms of like biologically and emotionally, how crying can be very therapeutic and help us grieve and move forward and process our feelings. And but then there's also the piece around a lot of people actually find that they can't cry or they feel numb or and that's perfectly normal as well. And sometimes there's a period of time where, you know, the person may feel blocked or like the emotions aren't coming out. And then at another point, something else may trigger the emotions to come out. And you know, I think it's just important to have compassion for yourself wherever you are. I think your point about crying at the gravesite, I think that is common, and I think that's another thing to have self-compassion around. Like it's
Hi.
perfectly fine, you know, whenever somebody is able to let that emotion out, whether it's before, during, or after. And of course, other people may have their interpretations around what crying or not crying means about the person's feelings, but it may or may not be accurate. And it's a
Okay,
really interesting, yeah, it's an interesting piece of it.
okay. And you mentioned there another thing there. You mentioned like anger. Say somebody dies, and this ties in with religion, and the person's saying, like, how could God let my father die? Like in your case, your mother. You say, I'm only 15. Why am I losing my father? I need my father, or I need my mother, or my brother, whoever, or sister, whoever has passed away. And that's the anger part. That's more complex, I would assume.
Yes, for sure. And there's usually a lot of different layers of emotions with grief. And one interesting piece about grief that we don't always think of is it usually does consist of conflicting feelings. So there is often a mixture of like good and bad memories, anger and sadness, you know, regret and joy. So it's a mixture, and that's perfectly common and normal. But I think that the anger piece, yeah, to your point, that is um frequently people feel that. And you know, sometimes faith can comfort people in that, in terms of why would this happen. Sometimes not, you know, there's not, it's, you know, none of us pretend to know exactly why things happen. And you know, some people look at it from a perspective of like karma or, you know, past life things. Some people don't believe in that, and I would say my beliefs have shifted a lot as well. And so I think that But one thing I do know is that grief and anger and all of that, it often launches us on a personal journey of healing and kind of exploration, whether it's just with ourselves or other loved ones that have been left
Mm.
behind. Sometimes it launches some sort of journey of, you know, studying certain
Right,
wellness or faith topics. Yeah.
right. Okay, I'll give a personal example of my own parents. Like my father
Yeah.
passed away, I think, when I was in my 20s, and my mother passed away, I think, when I was in my mid-30s. My father was diagnosed with cancer, and he was given like 1 year to live. He was a very religious man, and it was almost like when the doctors told him he had a year to live, he felt obligated to live 1 year, as if God was telling him, "I'm giving you 1 year." And it was almost to the day that he died. But he had a very comfortable year, and I think he used his faith and his religion to keep him comfort. And when he died at the end of that year, he was very much ready, as we say, to go. And we had good times and shared some nice times together. He was a very peaceful man, a very honest man. Sometimes in this podcast, I quote him for saying, "Shame the devil and tell the truth," but he was a very honest person. On the other hand, my mother was more skeptic, I guess, but she was ill for a long time too. And one evening by her bedside, we were just chatting as a son to a mother laying there in her bed. She wasn't at a dying point then, she was kind of comfortable. So I made her some hot whiskies and I had one or two myself. And we just talked like a mother to a son. And then she asked me a very profound question at the time. And she looked at me with her shining eyes and she said, "John, what is it like to die?" And I thought, oh, just a profound question. So I was lucky. I thought of a song by Jackson Brown, the singer. And in that song, Jackson Brown says, "Dying is the blink of an eye." So she looked up at me and she said, and she smiled. She said, "That gives me comfort." I felt very happy that it gave her comfort. And then she says, after a pause, "You know what?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "I hate pain." I said, "We all hate pain. Everybody hates pain." So I think her thought was she would rather die than be in pain. And indeed, that comes into the song Shane MacGowan wrote in The Fairy Tale of New York, that sometimes dying is better than being your legs chopped off in a war, or your limbs chopped off, or ending up in a terrible state of pain. My mother believed in euthanasia as well. So, like, they do it for dogs, they do it for horses. Have you any views on what I just said?
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I think people do, yeah, none of us like pain, right? And so everybody has a different, I think, philosophy or feelings around that about how, how much pain they want to tolerate or how they feel about it. I can't remember if I shared this with you last time, but I did also do end of life doula work for a little while.
Mm.
And, end of life is related, of course, to grief. It's a specific niche. And, I did see a lot of different families and people have different perspectives on what they wanted, at
Mm.
the end of life, what they felt comfortable with. And I think it's just really important to honor each person and how they feel and their family.
Mm-hmm.
And, some people, like you said, believe in things like euthanasia. Some people don't. And I think it's just important to have very honest, like you said, about heartfelt, honest conversations about what people
Right.
truly want, because it can vary a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said earlier there, not to repeat myself, but say someone in that situation, like reminiscing on good times this person had in their life gives them comfort. And now I'll come on to another situation like where my brother-in-law is in getting close to the end. He's in rehab. And my niece, Julie Hogan, said playing music for him gives him comfort. If it's like relaxing and soothing, it takes his mind away from whatever discomfort he may have. So it's like his favorite music, soothing music. And that's easy to do. It's just like push of a button, really and truly, in terms of music. And of course, don't forget, podcasts are good too. If people like to listen to stories, like friends of mine in Ireland, Davey Heaney, I think of here, he always listens to my podcast. I know he's in a rehab situation as well. Good spirits, and I know he'll have a good year ahead of him next year because we spoke about this at Halloween when I did some tarot cards for him and other people. So whatever gives the person comfort, I think, is important. And I'd like you to expand on that.
Yes, and I mean, I think that also a common thread that I've seen through end of life and grief is that of course, it's what really matters. It's like it becomes in such clear focus what really matters, which is really just the simple things, right? It's just loved ones and
Right,
family and like you said, comfort. And it's just really pure and simple, and all of the noise and all of the you know complicated things kind of fade away into the background, and it's just this very crystal clear clarity about being with loved ones usually, and holding someone's hand, and
yes,
yeah, like you said, playing music or just having a conversation about how much you love somebody and what
right,
they mean to you. And of course,
right,
for other people, maybe they don't feel comfortable vocalizing that, and that's fine too.
right,
But I think it's just about a gentle exploration, and that may be a conversation, or it may just be intuitively feeling into what the person needs at the moment.
right.
And everyone's different, and it's and like you said, it's yeah, it's a very transcendent kind of moment in time usually.
And oftentimes we hear, by the way, my guest today is Erin Moore. My podcast is called It's Good to Talk. And if you like the podcast, subscribe. We're dealing a topic with dealing with grief, death, and dying, which we all have to face at some point. But you often hear stories about people say that the doctor walked in and told them, you know, that they have 6 months or a year or whatever the case may be. And a phrase that I bit ambivalent about it, but when the doctor says to somebody, get your affairs in order, is I think it can be a little bit crude. I know someone getting saying, "Oh, you have a year to live," make your will. And I did have Lillian Conchor on here talking about how important it is to make a will. I think that should have been done anyways. But yeah, definitely get your affairs in order and delegate to somebody. If you can't do it yourself, don't be shy to ask for help to get the person's affairs in order. But dealing, say, where you're coming into the picture, I think he's dealing with the aftermath, where you're trying to help the people around the person that died. So tell me a little bit more about how your counseling works. Is it a one-off session or are there many more than one session? And explain all that to us.
Yes, well, thank you. So, I mean, I do sometimes do one-off sessions, and people are welcome to, do that. Although my grief sort of program, the way it usually works is, and people can add on additional sessions or do the sort of process more than once. But the initial sort of process program is usually about 7 meetings, and it's usually one-on-one, but I also do groups.
Okay.
So it can be on Zoom or in person.
Okay.
And I'm located in Boston, as I mentioned right now, although I do travel a fair bit. So sometimes I meet with people in other locations as
Mm.
well. Um, and it's usually seven meetings once a week. We could do it twice a week if people prefer, but it's a mixture of kind of like sharing and therapy and guidance. And then also there's specific sort of exercises. Some of it's reading, some of it's writing, and it's really effective tools that help people move through the grief in a way that's structured and it's safe. And so it's different from sort of traditional talk therapy, which can
Right.
of course also be helpful, but
Right.
it's really targeted tools to help people kind of deal with that baggage and the feelings at the
Right.
core, which is why it's special and effective.
Good. And I know my listeners want to know, nothing is for nothing. How much does a session cost or 7 sessions cost?
Yeah, so for 7 sessions, it's usually about $700 because it's seven. Usually, it's about $100 per session, and
Okay.
so if it's a 7 session, that's usually the ballpark.
Yeah, that's
And it's a
pretty
little bit
reasonable.
different for the group. It's usually a
Yeah,
little bit less.
but that's very reasonable. And how can people contact you if they're interested in dealing with, if they are having difficulty dealing with grief?
Yes. So my website is centeredone.com. It's centeredone.com. And then on there is linked my Instagram, which is the word centered underscore one by Erin, as well as my email, which is Erin, ERIN at centeredone.com. And yeah, and I do free calls for anyone interested who has questions. And then we can, determine if it's a fit for you and what you're looking for.
Right.
If you want to just do, I do, as I think I mentioned, I do also just do more of one-off healing, therapeutic type counseling
Right.
sessions too, or the program.
Okay. And I did tell someone I was having you on today as a guest, and they had a question for me to ask you. Say pets, someone say their dog dies. Do you deal with that? Or?
Yes, and I have to say I'm an animal lover as well. My dog is around here somewhere. And there's actually a specific version of my program for pet loss.
Okay.
So 100%. And that's, I mean, as we know, it's a huge, I mean, that could be a huge loss that sometimes is minimized.
Mm.
I also sometimes work with folks who have had other types of losses or life changes like divorce or relationship breakups,
Right.
or sometimes it's other things like moving or empty nests. It's sort of an endless list of life
Mm.
transitions that can bring up grief.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the moving because, like here at Liffey Van Lines, like we're serving the moving world for the last 50 years, and
Right.
we know as a team at Liffey, the full team, because we're extremely experienced, that moving can be a big experience. People like they're
Yes.
leaving their house maybe that they lived in for the last 20 or 30 years, so you're losing your house. Of
Yep.
course, you sold your house, but it still was your home where you were born, where your pets lived, where your children grew up. And that's like a transformation. And that's should be a celebration, but for some people it can be like a calamity. So from a mover's point of view, we make the move as smooth as possible for them and make them feel that when they move into their new location, that it very much resembles their old location in terms of where they want to position their furniture. They may want the pictures on the same format on a wall. They want their wedding photographs on a certain shelf or whatever. So the
Right.
transition is smooth and not drama. So
Right.
let's see what else. We've covered a lot actually,
Yeah.
given the topic and all that. So it's been a pleasure having you on again. And I do want to hope people go back and listen to your other podcast, one we did about a year and a half ago or more. I do want people to go back and listen to Christopher Roselli. I want to mention that because people did bring up to me about insurance, which is important because if somebody has a fire in their house and there's a loss like that, if the fire is sudden, it can be a lot of drama, a lot of stress, and then there's a physical loss of, say, someone losing their personal belongings, say their photographs, their music, and whatever else. That's a loss in itself. So I did speak to Christopher Roselli last week about something like that, and he has good advice. But that advice is in a podcast I did with Christopher Roselli, and you'll get him in Christopher Roselli brokerage firm. If you just go back into my podcast, but I'm just telling my listeners, they can find all the old podcasts there. And of course, music therapy is important, and I've done a lot of topics on music and massage therapy. I had Adam Cardona on here from Elite Healers. So massage therapy is good too, because you mentioned there earlier on the sense of touch and the human aspect of a hand, maybe holding a hand when at such a grave site or in his studio on Park Avenue, and maybe relaxing and unwinding with good memories of the person that passed away, hopefully. So have you anything else to add, Erin?
think so. Thank you so much for having me.
I
And
don't,
I think
it's always a pleasure to have you on,
yes,
and it's an interesting topic.
yes. And
I
it's
think it's
very,
important.
it is. And it's funny, like I always was aware of this, but it's now so much more clear to me too. Everywhere I turn, I'm like grief, grief, grief. It's just
Yeah,
like everywhere. We all go through
yeah,
so many things. And I think if we don't address them, they can build up and then come out in
yeah.
symptoms, whether it's physical symptoms or emotional symptoms,
I
anxiety.
totally agree. A few weeks back, I dealt with suicide prevention, and I had Barbara Vesely on here, and that too in itself is a topic that needs to be talked about. And I want to
Yes.
thank Barbara for being on. I think we dealt with it well. For my listeners again, you can look that up. So I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to say Sloan.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks, everyone.
Sloan and goodbye. Till we next time.
Till next time.
Bye bye.
Mwah.